I was 13 years old, standing in a kitchen that felt like the interior of a refrigerator, wearing 2 sweaters and still shivering. The silence in the house was heavy, not a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against my eardrums, amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat. Then, the stillness was shattered. My phone, sitting on the far edge of the counter, lit up violently, the screen flashing against the dark marble. It buzzed, vibrating against the stone with a harsh, rattling sound that echoed in the empty room. I hesitated for a moment before reaching for it, my numb fingers fumbling with the case. It was a group chat notification. Mom had created a group titled Holiday Bliss. I tapped the notification, and the screen loaded a high-resolution photograph that felt like a physical blow to my chest. In the photo, my mother, Susan, was holding a champagne flute up to the camera, her face beaming with a kind of radiant joy I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Next to her, my father, Jeffrey, looked relaxed, almost unrecognizable in a crisp linen shirt that suggested a climate far warmer than the one I was standing in. But it was the background that made the air leave my lungs. My twin sisters, Ashley and Jessica, were already wearing oversized sunglasses, clinking glasses together in what was undeniably the plush, cream-colored interior of a first-class cabin. They were laughing, heads thrown back, living a life that didn't include me. The caption beneath the photo read simply, "Finally some peace." A second later, a text message scrolled across the screen below the photo. "Simple and efficient, boarding now, see you in 10 days, house alarm is set, don't wait up." I stood there, paralyzed, the phone burning in my hand. I looked back at the turkey, the frozen centerpiece of a feast that would never happen. I was 13. I didn't know how to cook a 20-pound bird. I didn't know how to fix a furnace. And most devastatingly, I apparently wasn't worth a plane ticket. In that moment, the reality of my position in the family hierarchy solidified. I wasn't a daughter. I was an inconvenience, a piece of furniture they had forgotten to move into storage. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the hot sting of tears that usually accompanied a tantrum or a moment of sadness. I didn't text back asking why, or begging them to come home. I just stood there in the cold, the blue light of the phone fading, realizing that family was a word they used only when it was convenient for them, a label they applied when it suited their public image. And right now, in the silence of this freezing kitchen, I wasn't convenient. I was just excess baggage they had left on the tarmac. The silence returned, heavier than before, settling into the corners of the room like dust. I couldn't cook the turkey, and I certainly wasn't going to starve staring at it. I opened the freezer, the icy blast hitting my face like an open window in winter. I dug past the bags of frozen peas and the ice cream trays until I found a single, frozen burrito buried in the back corner. It was old, the wrapper coated in a thick layer of frost, the corners torn and grayed with freezer burn, but it was calories. It was survival. I peeled back the wrapper as best I could and threw it into the microwave. I punched the buttons, the digital display glowing a cheerful orange that mocked the gloom of the kitchen. I pressed start, and the machine hummed to life, the whir of the magnetron the only sign of life in the entire, massive house. I watched the plate spin through the greasy glass door, counting the seconds, waiting for the warmth. Then, with a sharp, electrical pop, the hum died. The cheerful orange light on the display vanished, plunging the kitchen into a deeper, more absolute darkness. Simultaneously, the refrigerator motor shuddered, gave a final groan, and stopped. The power was out. I stood in the sudden pitch blackness of the kitchen, the smell of the burrito already starting to fade. The cold, which had been creeping in from the edges of the room, smelling of old dust and winter, now seemed to rush forward to claim the space completely. My breath was invisible now, lost in the black. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. A strange calmness washed over me, a cold, rational detachment that felt too old for my 13 years. I just calculated. I had a coat upstairs. I had blankets on my bed. I could haul the mattress into the smallest room to conserve heat. I could survive the night if I stayed in one room, if I didn't move, if I didn't let the fear in. That was when the light swept across the kitchen window. Twin beams of high-intensity white light cut through the darkness, piercing the curtains and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the freezing air. They swept across the room like a searchlight, panning over the refrigerator, the counter, and finally landing on me. A car was pulling into the driveway. For a second, a pathetic, childish part of me, the part that still believed in the fairy tales of unconditional love, thought they had come back. I thought they had realized at the gate, or maybe on the tarmac, that they couldn't leave a 13-year-old alone in a freezing house for 10 days. That they had turned the plane around. My heart leaped, a traitorous spike of hope, and I ran to the window, scraping my hand against the wall in the dark. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see. It wasn't my parents' sedan. It was a massive, matte black SUV, idling in the driveway like a predator at the gate, its engine purring with a low, suppressed power. It was sleek, expensive, and menacing. A door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, silhouetted against the headlights, wearing a heavy wool coat that looked like it cost more than the car my mother drove. He didn't rush. He moved with a deliberate, slow pace, closing the door with a solid thud that I felt more than I heard. He walked to the front door with the steady, inevitable pace of a man who owned the ground he walked on. The doorbell didn't ring. Of course it didn't. The power was out. But a heavy knock echoed through the foyer, booming like a cannon shot in the quiet house. I walked to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs, and unlocked it. I pulled it open just a few inches, the chain still on, though I knew it wouldn't stop him if he wanted to come in. I knew who he was, though I had only seen him in hushed, whispered conversations at funerals or in the background of old photo albums that my mother kept hidden in a drawer. It was Uncle Robert, the black sheep. The billionaire industrialist my father called soulless and my mother called dangerous. He stood there, framed by the headlights of his car, snowflakes beginning to drift down around him. He didn't say hello. He didn't offer a hug or a platitude like, "Are you okay?" He looked at me, his eyes taking in my shivering frame in the oversized sweaters, the dark house behind me, and the frozen cloud of breath that escaped my lips as I exhaled. Then he looked past me, into the black void of the hallway, as if he could see the air temperature dropping. "They set the security alarm," he said, his voice like gravel grinding together, deep and rough. "But they didn't set up the auto pay for the electric bill." He didn't ask a question. He was stating a fact, a diagnosis of the dysfunction he was witnessing. He stepped inside, not waiting for an invitation, pushing the door open against my resistance. The cold air rushed in with him, but he radiated a heat that seemed to push the frost back. He pulled a leather glove off his hand, revealing long, pale fingers, and checked his watch, the face of it catching the light from his car outside. "Uncle Robert," I whispered, my voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer intensity of his presence. He looked down at me then. His eyes were gray, cold, and completely devoid of pity. They weren't cruel, they were just empty of emotion, analytical. He was assessing a problem, looking at a structural failure in a building he owned. "Pack a bag, Alyssa," he said. It wasn't a request. "Essentials only. You are not staying in a museum." "Where are we going?" I asked, clutching the doorknob. "Away from here," he said, turning back toward the hallway. "Now." I didn't argue. I didn't ask about my parents. I didn't ask about the turkey. I ran upstairs, my feet thudding on the carpet. I didn't pack toys. I didn't pack the framed photo of my family that sat on my nightstand, the one where we all looked so happy. I packed clothes, warm ones, my school books, and my laptop. I moved with a frantic efficiency, throwing things into a duffel bag. It took me 4 minutes. When I came back down, he was standing in the kitchen, looking at the 20-pound turkey still sitting on the counter, useless and freezing, a symbol of the abandonment. "Leave it," he said without turning around. "Let it rot, it suits them." I walked out the front door, the cold wind biting at my face, and climbed into the passenger seat of the SUV. The door closed with a heavy, expensive thud, sealing out the winter. The interior smelled of rich leather and conditioned air. It was warm. So warm it felt like a different planet. As we pulled away, the tires crunching on the frozen gravel, I watched my childhood home disappear in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the dark. I didn't know it then, but I had just crossed a border. I was leaving the world of the discarded and entering the world of the architects. I was leaving the people who posed for photos and entering the world of the people who built the backgrounds. Living with Uncle Robert wasn't about healing. It wasn't about warm cookies and soft talks about feelings. It was about recalibration. His house, a brutalist fortress of concrete and glass perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking a churning gray ocean, didn't have cozy corners. It had sightlines. It had structural integrity. It had silence. Not the empty, terrifying silence of my parents' house, but a deliberate, heavy silence that felt like a shield, a barrier against the chaos of the world. For the first few months, I tried to make myself invisible. I was an expert at it. I moved through rooms without making a sound, stepping on the edges of the rugs to avoid muffled thuds. I ate quickly, cleaning up immediately, and retreated to the guest room before anyone could remember I was there. I thought this was the rent I had to pay for existing, the price of the rescue. I thought if I was quiet enough, he wouldn't regret taking me. One evening, Robert found me sitting in the library, tucked into the shadow of a towering bookshelf, watching him work at his desk. He was reviewing blueprints, his face illuminated by a small lamp. I froze, waiting to be reprimanded for lurking, for being a burden. He didn't look up from his documents. "You're doing it again," he said, his voice low. "Doing what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, disappearing into the vastness of the room. "You think if you're quiet enough, you won't be a burden," he said, his pen scratching rhythmically on the paper. "You think silence is a deficit, something you have to apologize for." I stayed silent, unsure of what to say. He finally looked up, pinning me with that gray, analytical stare. "You're wrong. Silence is data." He beckoned me over with a crook of his finger. I approached the desk reluctantly. He pointed to a blueprint spread out before him, a complex commercial development, a maze of lines and dimensions. "Tell me what you see," he commanded. I looked at the lines. "I see a lobby, elevators, offices, a standard high-rise." "Look closer," he said. "What do you see?" I hesitated. I looked at the drawing, really looked at it, letting my natural instinct take over, the instinct honed by 13 years of watching a family that never watched me back. I studied the flow, the spacing. "The flow is wrong," I said, the words coming out faster than I could think them. "The reception desk faces the window. With that angle, the receptionist will be blinded by the afternoon sun every day. They'll be miserable. And the elevators, they're too far from the main entrance. People will congregate in the middle waiting, and they'll block the flow of traffic to the conference rooms. It's inefficient. It bottlenecks." Robert smiled. It was a terrifying, sharp thing, not a smile of joy, but of recognition. "Exactly," he said. "You see the flaws because you spend your life in the background watching how people move. Your family ignored you, Alyssa. They treated you like furniture. But while they were busy posing for photos, you were studying the room. You noticed the cracks in the foundation while they were admiring the paint." That was the moment the narrative shifted. He didn't offer me pity for being the forgotten child. He offered me a job description. "The gift of the shadow," he called it. "The ability to see the truth because no one thinks you're important enough to hide it from. You don't talk, Alyssa," he told me, leaning back in his chair. "You watch. That isn't weakness. That is dangerous. That is power." From that day on, my education began. He didn't buy me dolls or video games. He bought me textbooks on structural engineering, contract law, and negotiation tactics. He sat me down at his table and taught me that architecture wasn't just about buildings. It was about controlling behavior. If you control the structure, he explained, you control the people inside it. You control where they walk, where they sit, where they feel anxious, and where they feel safe. My teenage years weren't marked by proms or football games. They were marked by site visits and board meetings where I sat in the corner, a notepad on my lap, taking notes on who was lying, who was desperate, and who was trying to hide their incompetence. I stopped checking my phone for texts from my mother. I stopped looking at the photos of their vacations in the Bahamas or the Alps that popped up on social media. Those glossy images were just facades, cheap cladding over a rotting structure, and I was learning to look past the cladding to the beams underneath. I wasn't the abandoned daughter anymore. I was a project under construction, and the foundation was being poured with concrete, steel, and absolute, cold resolve. By the time I was 16, I had learned more about leverage, about debt, and about the fragility of the human ego than most adults learn in a lifetime. But there was one lesson left, a lesson in agency and creation. I needed a workspace. My desk was a card table I'd salvaged from the basement, and it wobbled every time I erased a line, throwing off my precision. I found Robert in the solarium one rainy afternoon, reviewing quarterly reports. "I need a new desk," I said, standing straight, "and a drafting lamp. The lighting in my room is insufficient for detail work." He didn't look up. "How much?" $800, I said. "I found a solid one online." He sighed, the sound like wind through a tunnel. "No." I blinked. He wasn't stingy. He drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. He bought companies on a whim. "Why not?" "Because buying you furniture teaches you nothing," he said, finally looking at me. "Building it teaches you everything." He pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket and scribbled on it. He tore the check out and slid it across the table. It was for $5,000. "This is your budget. I don't want you to buy a desk, Alyssa. I want you to design a sanctuary." He looked at me then, his eyes boring into mine, intense and burning. "Your family made you feel unsafe in your own home. They made you feel like a guest who overstayed her welcome. I want you to build a room where you are the authority, where you feel untouchable. If you can build that, you can build anything." I took the check. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than the paper it was printed on. I spent the next 3 months obsessed. I didn't just buy furniture. I curated an environment. I researched acoustics, ergonomics, and lighting temperature. I tore up the carpet in the guest room to reveal the concrete subfloor, which I sealed and polished. I painted the walls a deep, matte slate gray that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, making the room feel like a cocoon. I designed a custom L-shaped desk and hired a local welder to build the frame, negotiating the price down by pointing out flaws in his previous welds. I installed soundproofing foam in the corners to kill the echo. I bought an ergonomic chair that felt like a cockpit, molding to my spine. I created a space that wasn't soft or pretty. It was a command center. It was a place where I was the master of the domain. When it was finished, I called Robert in. He stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't touch anything. He checked the welds on the desk. He tested the throw of the light against the wall. He noted the acoustic panels and the angle of the monitor. He turned to me and nodded, just one sharp, decisive nod. "Good," he said. That nod was worth more than the $5,000. It was validation. It was the first time an adult had looked at something I created and treated it with respect, treated me with respect as a creator. Meanwhile, my phone kept buzzing with the ghost life of my other family. "Mom just landed in Aspen. The twins look adorable in their ski gear. Dad, thinking of you, hope you're studying hard." I scrolled past the photos of them drinking hot cocoa in a lodge I would never visit, wearing clothes that cost more than my first car. I looked at their smiling, vacuous faces. Years ago, that would have crushed me. I would have wondered what was wrong with me, why I wasn't enough. But sitting in my gray, silent sanctuary, surrounded by the smell of fresh paint and ozone, I realized something. Their rejection hadn't broken me. It had freed me. I didn't need their approval to fill a room. I could build my own walls. I could design my own life. The years blurred into a singular focus. I graduated high school early, skipping the trivialities of senior prom to focus on my internship at a firm Robert had introduced me to. I went to architecture school, funded entirely by Robert, who called it an investment in infrastructure. I graduated top of my class, not because I wanted the grades, but because I wanted the knowledge. I started my own firm at 24. By 28, I was designing skylines. I was the architect, and my foundation was unshakable. Uncle Robert didn't fade away quietly. He concluded. It was a business decision in his eyes. His heart was failing. The structural integrity of the organ was compromised beyond repair. He refused the hospital, the machines, the indignity of lingering. He chose the master bedroom overlooking the ocean where he could monitor the tides, the eternal rhythm of the world. 2 days before the end, he summoned me. He wasn't sentimental. He was strategic to the last breath. "Sit," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves skittering on concrete. He pointed a trembling finger to a thick, sealed manila envelope on the nightstand. "That is the demolition order. Do not open it until the reading." "I won't," I said, sitting on the edge of the bed, taking his cold hand. "They will come back, Alyssa," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. "The moment the heart monitor flatlines, they will smell the money. They think I am their ATM. They think you are the janitor who swept the floors." He gripped my wrist, his strength surprising me for a man on the edge of death. "Don't let them in, not into your head, not into this house." He died on a Tuesday morning, efficiently between the hours of 4 and 5 a.m., just as the sun was beginning to bleed over the horizon. I didn't cry then. I had work to do. I called the lawyer. I called the funeral home. I secured the perimeter. I was the architect now, and I was managing the transition. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was supposed to be a small, private service at the Cliffside Chapel, a gathering of his business associates and a few old friends. But at 10:55 a.m., a fleet of 3 stretched limousines rolled up the gravel drive, crunching loudly on the stones. They were rented. I recognized the company plates on the bumpers. My family stepped out. They were dressed in designer morning wear, black silk, oversized sunglasses, and veils that did more to frame their faces than hide them. My mother, Susan, practically collapsed into my father's arms, sobbing loudly for a brother she hadn't spoken to in 15 years. My sisters, Ashley and Jessica, were live streaming their grief, holding their phones up like selfie sticks, dabbing at dry eyes with lace handkerchiefs. They looked like a bad production of a Greek tragedy, overacting and underfeeling. I stood by the grave, wearing a sharp charcoal suit I had designed myself, the lines sharp enough to cut. They walked right past me. They didn't see the CEO of a multi-million-dollar firm standing in front of them. They didn't see the woman Robert had built. They saw the 13-year-old girl in the frozen kitchen. They saw a nonentity. "Poor Robert," I heard Susan whisper to Jeffrey, loud enough for half the congregation to hear. "He died alone, so tragic." "Thank God he didn't marry," Jeffrey replied, adjusting his tie. "The estate should cover the bankruptcy and the renovations on the summer house. We can finally fix the roof." They weren't mourning. They were calculating. They were appraising the corpse. After the service, they cornered me near the hearse. They didn't hug me. They didn't ask how I was holding up. "Alyssa," my father said, his voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing tone he used when explaining things to a child. "You look tired. You've done a good job holding the fort, but, well, you look like you haven't been sleeping." He thought I was the nurse. He thought I was the help. "We'll take it from here, sweetie," my mother added, patting my arm with a gloved hand, a gesture of dismissal. "You've done your duty. We're going to head up to the house to appraise the furniture. We need to see what's worth keeping before the estate sale. Robert always had terrible taste anyway, so brutal." She held out her hand, palm up. "Do you have the keys, or do we need to call a locksmith?" I looked at them, really looked at them, and suddenly the architecture of their cruelty made perfect sense. For them to be the golden family, the beautiful, successful people they pretended to be, they needed a failure. They needed me to be the broken, abandoned niece who scrubbed the floors and lived in the shadows. If they acknowledged that I was the one in power, that I was the architect, that I was the heir, their entire self-image would collapse. They needed me to be small so they could feel big. They weren't just vultures circling a carcass. They were parasites starving for a host. "The lawyer has the keys," I lied, my voice flat and cold, like a sheet of ice. "The reading is tomorrow at the firm. Until then, the house is sealed." "Sealed," Ashley scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "It's our house. We're his family. You can't lock us out." "Tomorrow," I said, enunciating the word clearly. "Until then, the property is under private security." I turned my back on them. I walked to my car, a sleek black sports car that Robert had bought me for my 25th birthday, and got in. I watched them in the rearview mirror, arguing with the security guards I had hired to keep the gate locked. They were screaming, pointing at their designer clothes as if that granted them access. I put the car in gear and drove away. The conference room at the law firm was designed to intimidate. It was all dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows, and air conditioning set to a temperature that kept you awake and alert. My family sat on one side of the long table, looking like they had wandered into the wrong building. Jeffrey was checking his watch, tapping a manicured finger against the polished wood, looking bored. Susan was whispering to the twins, Ashley and Jessica, who were scrolling through real estate listings on their phones, already spending the money. They looked at me only once, with a mixture of pity and annoyance, like I was a stain on the tablecloth they couldn't quite scrub out. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, entered the room. He was an older man, sharp and severe. He didn't carry a briefcase. He carried a single, thin file folder. He sat down at the head of the table and adjusted his glasses. Robert preferred efficiency, he said, his voice dry as dust. So I will be brief. Just read the numbers, Jeffrey said, leaning back in his chair and draping his arm over the back. We know he was liquid. Let's get to the distribution. Sterling ignored him completely. He opened the folder. To my brother, Jeffrey, he read, his voice monotone, I leave you the debt you accrued in 1998. The promissory note for the failed venture is hereby forgiven. You are now solvent. You are welcome. Jeffrey blinked. He sat forward, his face twisting in confusion. What? That debt was written off years ago. I don't want a piece of paper. Where is the cash? Where are the assets? Sterling continued, his eyes scanning the page. To my sister-in-law, Susan, I leave you the silence you gave your daughter. May it bring you the same comfort it brought her. Susan's mouth fell open. She looked around the room, laughing nervously. I don't understand. Is this a joke? Silence. What does that mean? And finally, Sterling said, looking directly at me, his eyes softening for the first time. To my niece, Alyssa, the architect of her own life, I leave the entirety of my estate. The firm, the properties, the investment portfolios, the cliffside house, and the residual assets. Everything. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then it detonated. That's illegal, Jeffrey screamed, slamming his hand on the table so hard the water glasses rattled. He was senile. She manipulated him. She was his nurse. She brainwashed him. We're contesting this. I'll tie this up in court for years. We're the family, Ashley shrieked, dropping her phone on the table. That's our money. You can't leave it to a stranger. She's not even a Miller. She's just a girl he took in. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I watched them unravel with the detached interest of a scientist observing bacteria under a slide. Their faces were red, their necks bulging, their composure shattered. They weren't grieving anymore. They were starving. Sterling raised a hand, a gesture of quiet authority that cut through the noise. There is one more document, he said. The room quieted instantly, heavy with the desperate hope that this was the correction, the real will, the mistake that would give them what they wanted. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, Sterling said, looking at my parents. You claim Alyssa coerced Robert. You claim she is a usurper. However, this document suggests a very different dynamic. He slid a single piece of paper across the mahogany table toward Jeffrey. It was yellowed with age, the edges brittle. I recognized Robert's sharp, angular handwriting immediately. And next to it, the loopy, careless signatures of my parents. What is this? Susan whispered, her voice trembling. A loan agreement, Sterling said. Dated December 24th, 15 years ago. My blood ran cold. The date, the frozen turkey, the empty house, the day they left. You borrowed $500,000 from Robert, Sterling continued, his voice devoid of emotion, just a courier of facts. The funds were transferred to your account on the morning of December 24th. The purpose listed was gambling debts and lifestyle maintenance. He looked over his glasses. Robert agreed to pay this debt on one condition. He pointed to a clause at the bottom of the page, highlighted in red. Collateral. Sterling read the text aloud, his voice echoing in the silent room. In exchange for this sum, Jeffrey and Susan Miller agree to waive all parental claim to Alyssa Miller. They agree to transfer physical custody to Robert Miller and cease all financial and emotional support. They agree that the child is the burden of the lender, effective immediately upon transfer of funds. The world stopped turning. They hadn't forgotten me. They hadn't just been negligent. They hadn't just left me alone because they were thoughtless. They had sold me. I looked at the paper, at the signatures next to the dollar amount. $500,000. That was my price tag. That was why they never called. That was why they never came back. It wasn't because I was unlovable. It wasn't because I was difficult. It was because they had cashed the check. I had been traded for a payout to cover their bad habits and their expensive clothes. I looked up at my parents. I expected to see shame. I expected to see regret, maybe even horror at what they had done. Instead, I saw annoyance. I saw defensiveness. We were in a bind, Jeffrey shouted, pointing a finger at me. You don't know what it was like. We were drowning. He had all the money. It was the only way he would help us. We did what we had to do to survive. We gave you a better life, didn't we? You lived in a mansion, you went to good schools, we sacrificed you." Susan cried, tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears for me. They were tears for herself, for the humiliation of being exposed. "It cost you exactly $500,000, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was the voice of the architect, calm, level, and precise. "And you spent it all, every penny." "This is entrapment," Jeffrey screamed at the lawyer. "He can't hold that against us. That was years ago. We want our share. That's our daughter's inheritance. It belongs to the family." "You got your share," I said. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, a jarring sound in the quiet room. I buttoned my jacket. 15 years ago, you traded a daughter for a lifestyle. The transaction is complete. You accepted the funds. You signed the paper. You waived your rights." I looked at the document one last time. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a receipt. The room was silent, saved for the hum of the air conditioning. I stood there looking down at the people who had given me life and then sold it for a quick payout. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't feel the burning rage I used to feel when I looked at the photos of their vacations. I felt clarity, the kind of clarity you get when you finally see the structural flaw in a building that's been doomed from the start. You can't fix the flaw. You can only tear it down and build something new in its place. "Alyssa, please," my mother whimpered, reaching a trembling hand toward me across the table. "We're your parents. You have to help us. It's the right thing to do." I looked at her hand. It was trembling, not with love, but with the desperate realization that the ATM was closed. The machine was empty. "No," I said. "You're borrowers, and your credit is no good here." I turned and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back. I walked through the lobby of the law firm, past the receptionist who nodded respectfully, knowing who I was, and out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the parking lot. I got into my car and drove. I drove past the city limits, past the suburbs where families were living lives I would never understand, and up the winding coastal road to the cliffside house, my house. When I arrived, the gate was open. Security was escorting a familiar black sedan off the property. My parents. They had come straight here, hopping to beg, to steal, to break in. I stopped my car in the driveway and got out. Jeffrey saw me. He rolled down his window, his face twisted with rage, red and splotchy. "You ungrateful little bitch," he screamed. "We are your family, you owe us." "Get off my property," I said. My voice was calm, but it carried over the sound of the ocean waves below, clear and sharp. "Or I will have you arrested for trespassing." "This isn't over," he screamed as the security guard waved him forward, forcing him to move. "We'll sue, we'll take everything." "You already took everything," I said. "And you spent it, now get out." I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing around the bend in the road, swallowed by the trees. Then I turned back to the house. The brutalist concrete structure rose against the sky, stark and unyielding. It wasn't warm. It wasn't fuzzy. It wasn't a home filled with cozy clutter and staged photos, but it was strong. It was solid. It was mine. I walked inside and closed the heavy front door. The silence of the house greeted me, not as an emptiness, but as a presence. I turned the deadbolt. Click. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I walked to the kitchen, opened my laptop, and logged into my contacts. I hovered my finger over the mouse. I didn't hesitate. Susan Miller, delete. Jeffrey Miller, delete. Ashley Miller, delete. Jessica Miller, delete. One by one, I erased them. I blocked their numbers. I filtered their emails straight to trash so I would never have to see their desperation again. I dismantled the connection with the same precision I used to draft blueprints. I closed the laptop. The house was silent. The table in the dining room, the massive mahogany table where Robert had taught me how to negotiate, how to plan, how to win, was empty. It was perfect. I stood there in the silence of my fortress, the architect of my own life, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to come home. I was already there.